When a narcissist knows you're onto them, they'll do the unthinkable. The invisible moment, when you shift from useful to a threat. You think you have seen through a narcissist, you recognize the manipulation, the deception, the carefully rehearsed lies. You believe you finally hold the advantage, but the moment he realizes you are no longer deceived, everything changes. He will do something you never expected, something unthinkable. What exactly will he do, and what follows from that shift? Stay with this reflection, because understanding this moment may protect you from a far deeper spiritual and emotional crisis. That question unsettles because it points to a truth most people only recognize after harm has already taken root. The most dangerous moment in a narcissistic dynamic is not confusion, dependence, or emotional entanglement. It is the quiet arrival of clarity without confrontation, without accusation, without any outward display. For a long time, you may have been experienced as useful, not loved in the Christian sense of mutual regard, but useful in a functional sense. You were predictable, you absorbed tension, you extended patience, you explained yourself when things felt unclear. These are not moral failures. For many people of faith, they are virtues shaped by conscience and humility. Yet usefulness, when taken without gratitude or reciprocity, gradually replaces respect. And when you begin to withdraw that usefulness, not in anger, but in alignment, you change your position in the narcissist's inner world. This shift is subtle. You stop arranging yourself around their emotional needs. You pause where you once hurried. You allow silence to stand without filling it. Something in you becomes less accessible, less malleable. The narcissist notices, not because you announced awareness, but because your energy no longer moves toward them in the same way. Unpredictability, to a narcissistic structure, is perceived as threat. This is the invisible moment, the quiet passage, from being a source of regulation to being something they can no longer control. And it is here, long before overt conflict, that the dynamic begins to move. If you are listening and sensing that this reflects your own experience, this channel exists for you. You may choose to subscribe, so these reflections remain available as you continue learning how to see clearly, without losing your faith, your conscience, or your sense of self. Because once this shift takes place, what begins inwardly does not remain contained. While you may still be discerning what you are noticing, something within the relationship has already started to change, and that movement does not stop where it began. They know before you do. While you're still doubting, they've already changed tactics. One of the most unsettling truths in this dynamic is that recognition does not unfold at the same pace for both sides. You move slowly, inwardly, cautiously. The narcissist does not. Long before you feel certain enough to name what you are seeing, they have already registered the shift. At this stage, you are still questioning yourself. You replay conversations. You examine your tone. You ask whether you are being unfair, uncharitable, or overly sensitive. For someone shaped by faith, this hesitation is familiar. You were taught to look inward first, to question your own motives before assigning intent to another. That instinct toward humility keeps you grounded, but it also delays certainty. The narcissist does not wait for certainty. They do not need confrontation. They are attuned to subtleties most people overlook. A pause where there was once immediacy, a response that arrives later than expected, a presence that no longer feels eager to accommodate. These changes may feel insignificant to you. To them, they are unmistakable. This is the moment they know. Not because you accused them, not because you exposed anything out loud, but because your behavior shifted before your understanding fully caught up. While you are still discerning, they have already adjusted. The change in their tactics is rarely obvious. It does not begin with anger or withdrawal. It often begins with refinement. They may sound more attentive, more careful, even more considerate, or they may subtly test boundaries, watching closely to see whether your old responses can still be triggered. This is not confusion, it is strategy. What makes this phase especially disorienting is that nothing has happened yet in a way you can point to. There is no clear offense, no dramatic incident that justifies distance, and so you remain suspended between intuition and doubt. You feel the ground shifting, but you hesitate to step back fully because you cannot yet explain why. The narcissist experiences this hesitation differently. Your uncertainty feels like resistance. Your quiet feels heavier than confrontation ever would, and because their sense of stability depends on emotional leverage, they cannot leave this shift unaddressed. From a spiritual perspective, this is not a moment for accusation or action. It is a moment for discernment. You are not being asked to decide what the other person is. You are being invited to observe what happens when you stop managing the dynamic for them. When you no longer rush to clarify, reassure, or smooth over tension that is not yours to carry. Often, this is when subtle pressure begins to emerge, a pull to return to the old rhythm, a quiet expectation that you will resume being accessible, responsive, and emotionally available in the same way. Not because you have done harm, but because the relationship relied on your willingness to absorb imbalance. If you are listening and recognize this stage, the space where doubt still lingers, yet your behavior has already changed, you do not need to explain or justify it. You may simply mark that recognition by writing, "I noticed the change," or 77 inches, the comments. Not as a declaration of certainty, but as a private acknowledgement of discernment. Because once this phase begins, the dynamic no longer rests where it once did. One person is quietly seeing, the other is already adapting, and the relationship has started to move in a direction that reveals far more through actions than through words. The decisive sign. Your authenticity makes them panic. There is a specific moment often overlooked that marks the true turning point in this dynamic. It does not arrive through confrontation. It is not announced by accusation, proof, or exposure. It appears quietly, almost invisibly, within an ordinary exchange. You are simply speaking as yourself, not performing, not managing their emotions, not anticipating how your words will be received. You speak plainly, or you choose silence without anxiety. There is no attempt to persuade, soften, or maintain harmony at your own expense. For the first time, you are not positioning yourself in relation to them. You are simply present where you stand. This is the decisive sign. From the outside, nothing appears dramatic. Yet internally, something fundamental has shifted. The narcissist senses it immediately, not because of what you said, but because of what you no longer did. You did not seek approval. You did not brace for reaction. You did not adjust yourself to preserve the familiar emotional rhythm. For a narcissistic structure, this is deeply unsettling. Their sense of stability depends not only on control, but on participation, your reactions, your explanations, your emotional labor. When that participation quietly withdraws, panic does not erupt outwardly, it settles inward. This is why authenticity is so threatening. Authenticity removes leverage without confrontation. It does not challenge authority, it renders authority irrelevant. And when authority loses relevance, control must find another path to reassert itself. Spiritually, this moment reflects an interior realignment. You are no longer negotiating your inner truth for relational stability. You are no longer measuring your words against the fear of consequence. You are not hardening yourself, but you are no longer pliable. This is not rebellion, it is grounding. The narcissist does not experience this grounding as neutrality. They experience it as loss. Your calm registers as disengagement, Your steadiness feels like withdrawal. And because their inner balance depends on external regulation, your independence creates internal disorganization. What often follows is subtle rather than overt. They may lean in emotionally. They may appear unusually reflective. They may mirror your language, your tone, even your vulnerability. This is not coincidence. It is an attempt to restore the former rhythm by matching your presence instead of confronting it. If emotional engagement can be re-established, influence can be recovered without revealing fear. Yet something in you notices the difference. The exchange feels slightly misaligned, not obviously false, but off-center. Their openness does not deepen mutual understanding, it redirects attention. Their engagement does not meet you, it draws the focus back toward them. From a Christian perspective, this distinction matters. Authentic encounter leads toward shared responsibility and truth. Performative encounter leads toward confusion and fatigue. One carries weight, but also clarity. The other leaves heaviness without resolution. This is often when the body recognizes what the mind has not yet named. You may leave the interaction feeling inexplicably drained, not angry, not wounded, simply heavier. That weight is not evidence of failure, it is information. At this point, the narcissist understands something essential. You are no longer afraid of their disapproval, not because you are defiant, but because you are no longer organized around them. And once that realization takes hold, the dynamic cannot remain neutral. The familiar tools no longer work. A different strategy begins to form beneath the surface. The first unthinkable act, feigned vulnerability as manipulation. When authenticity no longer pulls you back into the familiar rhythm, something subtle but decisive begins to appear. It is not aggression, it is not withdrawal. It is something far more confusing, because on the surface it looks like connection. This is often the first unthinkable act. The narcissist begins to display vulnerability. Not vulnerability as an act of truth, but vulnerability as a strategy. They may speak softly. They may reference past pain, regret, or struggle. They may appear emotionally open, reflective, even self-aware. To an outside observer, and sometimes even to you, it can look like growth, like sincerity, like the beginning of accountability. Yet something in the exchange does not settle. What they offer does not meet what you expressed. It redirects it. The focus quietly shifts away from what you said and toward how they feel. Your clarity becomes background. Their emotional display becomes central. And the original meaning of the conversation is slowly replaced by a new narrative, one that recenters them without ever addressing the truth that unsettled them. This is not coincidence. It is not confusion. It is a recalibration of control. In the original dynamic, your emotions may have been the primary resource. Your reactions, your explanations, your attempts to restore harmony, all of these kept the relationship regulated. When those responses fade, vulnerability becomes the fastest way to re-engage you emotionally without revealing fear or loss of control. You were honest, so they perform honesty. You were open, so they stage openness. You were grounded, so they mirror reflection. But this mirrored vulnerability lacks weight. It does not lead toward shared responsibility. It does not deepen mutual understanding. Instead, it creates a subtle emotional pull, drawing your attention back into their internal world. From a spiritual standpoint, this distinction is essential. True vulnerability moves toward truth, repair, and responsibility. Feigned vulnerability moves toward reassurance, absolution, and regained influence. One carries humility. The other carries urgency disguised as tenderness. This is why many people leave these conversations feeling unsettled rather than relieved. The words sounded right, the tone felt appropriate, and yet the body registers something else, a heaviness, a fatigue, an emotional hangover that arrives without clear explanation. That heaviness is not proof of cruelty or lack of compassion on your part. It is information. It signals that emotional energy was extracted without mutual exchange. Something was taken, but nothing was resolved. In Christian discernment, peace is not always comfort, but it is coherence. When vulnerability is genuine, even difficult conversations leave a sense of alignment. When vulnerability is performed, the result is confusion because truth was displaced, not engaged. At this stage, the narcissist is not seeking reconciliation. They are seeking re-entry. They are attempting to pull you back into the familiar role where your empathy, faith, or patience once stabilized the dynamic. And they do so without open force, because force would expose desperation. This is why this act feels unthinkable, not because vulnerability itself is wrong, but because it is being used in a way that contradicts its purpose. What should open space for truth is instead used to close space around control. You may notice that after these moments, the original issue quietly disappears. The concern you raised is never fully addressed. The clarity you brought is blurred, and you are left holding emotional weight that does not belong to you. This is the first clear signal that the dynamic has crossed into a new phase. Control is no longer assumed. It is being actively restored carefully, indirectly, and with great attention to appearances. And once vulnerability becomes a tool rather than a bridge, the relationship does not return to balance. It continues to reorganize itself, pressing toward a more overt repositioning of responsibility that soon begins to surface in ways that are harder to ignore. The dangerous reversal. When they turn you into the problem, once vulnerability has been used and no longer yields the desired effect, the dynamic begins to shift in a quieter, more corrosive direction. This is not the moment of open hostility. It is the moment of inversion when responsibility subtly changes hands, and you begin to feel as though the tension itself is somehow your fault. Nothing is said directly. There are no accusations yet. Instead, the pressure appears internally. You begin to second-guess your need for distance. You feel uneasy for wanting space. You hesitate before speaking, not because you lack clarity, but because you do not want to cause discomfort. The relationship starts to feel heavier, even as the surface remains calm. This is the dangerous reversal. The narcissist reframes the dynamic so that your discernment appears excessive, your boundaries appear harsh, and your withdrawal appears unkind. What began as quiet alignment within yourself is slowly recast as a problem that needs explanation. And because you are someone who values conscience, you feel compelled to examine yourself once again. For people shaped by faith, this stage cuts deeply. You were taught that love is patient, that charity bears with weakness, that humility requires self-examination. And so when discomfort arises, you look inward. You ask whether you are failing in compassion. You wonder whether endurance would be the more righteous choice. Yet something important is happening beneath that moral questioning. Responsibility is being displaced. The narcissist does not say, "You are wrong." No, they imply, "You have changed." They do not say, "I crossed a boundary." They suggest, "You are overreacting." And because these implications are subtle, they are difficult to confront. They live in tone, timing, and emotional atmosphere rather than words. The relationship begins to feel like a place where any choice you make carries cost. If you remain present, you feel drained. If you pull back, you feel guilty. If you speak, you fear being misunderstood. If you stay silent, you fear being cold. This is not confusion, it is a bind. From a psychological perspective, this stage relies on internalized responsibility. From a spiritual perspective, it exploits conscience. Your desire to act rightly is used against you not through accusation, but through suggestion. What makes this reversal so powerful is that it feels reasonable. There is no obvious cruelty. Everything appears polite, considerate, even caring. And yet, the sense of pressure grows. You feel boxed in by expectations that are never clearly stated, yet constantly present. This is where many people begin to shrink themselves again, not because they want to, but because the discomfort of being seen as the problem feels heavier than the discomfort of returning to the old role. The narcissist does not need to demand compliance. The structure of guilt does the work for them. In Christian discernment, this is a critical moment. Charity without truth becomes distortion. Humility without boundaries becomes erasure. Love does not require you to carry responsibility that does not belong to you. The unease you feel here is not a failure of faith. It is a signal that something has been inverted. When alignment with truth produces guilt rather than peace, the source of that guilt must be questioned. At this stage, the narcissist is no longer trying to regain closeness. They are trying to restore hierarchy, and hierarchy requires someone to stand beneath it. You may notice that the original issues are no longer discussed. The focus has shifted entirely to your reactions, your tone, your distance. The conversation is no longer about what happened. It is about who you are becoming. This is how the reversal completes itself. You move from being someone who noticed a change to someone who feels responsible for it. And once that repositioning takes hold, the dynamic does not stabilize. It intensifies. Because when internal pressure is not enough to restore control, the dynamic seeks reinforcement elsewhere, beyond the private space of the relationship, into the wider story that begins to form around you. Ruthless escalation, attacking your reputation behind your back. When internal pressure no longer restores the old order, the dynamic widens. What once unfolded quietly between two people begins to move beyond the room. This is not announced. It does not arrive with open confrontation. It emerges indirectly, through tone, implication, and story. You may not hear about it at first. Often you sense it before you see it, a subtle change in how others respond, a hesitation where warmth once existed, a pause in conversation when you enter a space. Something in the atmosphere feels tighter, less open, as though a narrative has already begun without you. This is the escalation. The narcissist turns toward reputation, not out of malice alone, but out of necessity. When control within the relationship can no longer be maintained, control must be re-established elsewhere. And the most efficient place to do that is perception. This rarely begins with blatant falsehoods. It often starts with suggestion, concern expressed as care, observation framed as worry. You are described as not yourself lately, under a lot of stress, acting differently, or going through something. These statements sound benign, even compassionate. Yet they quietly plant a frame, one that positions your discernment as instability and your distance as dysfunction. In time, suggestion may harden into accusation. Your motives are questioned, your credibility is softened. Small distortions are introduced and repeated until they acquire weight. By the time you become aware that something is being said, the story already feels established. From a spiritual perspective, this is a moment of painful clarity. Not because the behavior is shocking, but because it reveals how quickly truth can be replaced by convenience. Those who benefit from the narcissist's orbit through proximity, approval, protection, or belonging are rarely neutral. Their silence, their acceptance, or their participation tells you where their allegiance lies. This is where many people make their most costly mistake. They try to explain. They try to clarify. They try to correct the record. Not out of pride, but out of a desire for fairness. They believe that truth, once presented, will restore balance, yet explanation often deepens the trap. Those who accept a narrative without coming to you were not waiting for understanding, they were already aligned. And when you step into defense mode, you confirm the frame that has been set, that you are reactive, unstable, or in need of justification. Christian discernment does not require silence at all times, but it does require wisdom about where truth can be received. Not every audience is capable of hearing it, and not every relationship is anchored in a shared commitment to honesty. This stage is ruthless not because it is loud, but because it is isolating. You may feel the loss of social ground beneath you. You may feel misunderstood without having spoken. You may feel the urge to reclaim your name, even as something within you knows that force will not restore what was never rooted in truth. Here, restraint becomes an act of faith, not passive resignation, but trust that truth does not require performance to endure. In Scripture, reputation is not preserved through self-defense, but through consistency of character. What is false eventually collapses under its own weight. What is true stands quietly until it is seen. The narcissist's escalation reveals something essential. They can no longer govern your interior world. And because they cannot reach you directly, they attempt to reach around you. The story becomes a substitute for control. This is not the moment to harden your heart, nor to surrender it. It is the moment to remain steady, to observe who seeks you out and who does not, to notice who values proximity over truth and who values truth even when it costs them comfort. As this stage unfolds, something clarifies. You begin to see which connections were sustained by misunderstanding and which were sustained by mutual integrity. The loss is real, the grief is real, but so is the separation that quietly takes place between what was contingent and what is enduring. And, as the external story continues to circulate, another truth begins to surface, one that does not depend on your participation. The narcissist's actions are no longer about influence, they are about exposure. And when exposure begins, the dynamic has already entered its final phase, where control is no longer asserted, but revealed as absent. The final truth. They do the unthinkable because you've escaped. At this point, it becomes tempting to interpret everything that has unfolded as proof of who they are. And while clarity is necessary, this final moment is not about defining the narcissist. It is about understanding what has quietly changed within you. The actions that now appear excessive, calculated, or even cruel did not arise because you attacked, exposed, or defeated anyone. They arose because something essential was withdrawn. You are no longer available in the same way. Your interior life is no longer organized around their reactions. And that absence cannot be tolerated by a structure that depends on control for stability. From a Christian perspective, this is not a moment for triumph. It is a moment for sobriety. Scripture does not invite us to celebrate another's unraveling, but it does invite us to recognize truth when it reveals itself. What is being exposed here is not power, but dependency, not strength, but fragility hidden behind strategy. The unthinkable acts that emerge are not evidence of your responsibility or your failure. They are evidence that the relationship can no longer function as it once did. When influence is gone, appearance becomes the last refuge. When access is closed, story replaces presence. This is why discernment matters more than interpretation. You are not called to predict consequences or to assign punishment. That work does not belong to you. You are called to remain aligned, to stay grounded in conscience, steady in behavior, and consistent in truth. There is a quiet dignity in this posture. You do not rush to explain yourself. You do not seek vindication. You do not carry what was never yours to hold. You allow what has been revealed to stand without embellishment or defense. In faith, This is not passivity, it is trust. Trust that what is rooted in truth does not require force to endure. Trust that what collapses under exposure was never sustained by love. And trust that separation, when it comes, is not always loss, but sometimes protection.